Margaret Thatcher did not believe in the early 80s that communism would end in her lifetime. She thought it would end eventually, but it would outlast her. Of course, she happened to be on the battlefield when communism finally ended. When the Soviet tanks were approaching the Moscow Parliament building, Boris Yeltsin, at the head of the Russian Democrats then, rang her in London, and at his request she went out onto the street and appealed to the world to support the Russian Democrats against the tanks. Western governments at that time were wavering. Well, as we know, the tanks turned back. The coup failed. Communism finally and definitively perished. But it wasn't surprising that she was wrong, that she'd been too pessimistic, because nobody believed in the late 70s and early 80s that communism was in trouble. Soviet communism was advancing in the world at that time. It was advancing in 1978. When Pope John Paul II was elected. It was advancing in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher entered number 10 Downing Street. It was advancing in 1980 when Ronald Reagan became president. I wrote a book about these three figures and their role in the end of communism, but I am convinced that none of them thought that communism would end as quickly as it did. Its ending just over a decade later, therefore, is one of the most remarkable collapses in human history. It's an incredible event. It took place, speaking historically, in a very short time. In 1977, just before these amazing events, Vladimir Bukovsky, the great anti-Soviet dissident, arrived in the West. He was expelled. And he was asked a question at his first press conference. Somebody said, "How many political prisoners remain behind in the Soviet Union, Mr. Bukovsky?" And he replied, 280 million. He went on to say that virtually everybody, even members of the Politburo, were in a sense political prisoners in the Soviet Union. And so the end of the Soviet Union is really a story of, or rather 280 million stories of human liberation. Now, my colleagues have collected many of these stories, not 280 million, but more, I think, more richly than has been done in any other place. They're stories of the people who achieved freedom, who made sacrifices for it. They're stories of people who used to be on the other side of the barricades with the police and the army, who, as I say, just packed up and quietly went home and refused to support the system anymore. These are all very dramatic and amazing stories. We can only thank God, and we can thank the individuals who played major roles, that they were able to bring about such a remarkable and such a beneficent historical change.